Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, for this last session. I'm delighted to be here. I'm thrilled to be back in Lahore. I love coming to Pakistan. I first came to Pakistan in 1978. So for all those lovely people who say to me, is this your first visit to Pakistan? I have to disillusion them and say, no, I came here 40 years ago. So with that minor introduction, I first went to the Valley of Kashmir in 1981. And consequently, Kashmir scars, which is the subject we're going to be discussing today, is a subject very close to my heart because I have actually seen the Kashmir issue, as it's called, since my first visit in 1981. What I want to just make you all envisage, unfortunately we don't have a map here, but we do get sometimes stuck in our own rhetoric about Kashmir, and we use the shorthand version, and we journalists do the same thing. We talk about Kashmir, the Kashmir issue, the Kashmir dispute. But if you can imagine the map of the state, the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, like a great butterfly straddling the Himalayan mountains, it is not a monolith. And we cannot forget that the official name of the state is the state of Jammu and Kashmir, but it comprises very distinct regions: Ladakh, Gilgit-Baltistan, the narrow strip, which in Pakistan, Azad Jammu and Kashmir, in India it's called Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, the Jammu region, and then of course the valley. The valley constitutes very little of the territory, in fact, 80 miles long, 20 to 25 miles wide. So when we're looking for solution, we're looking for resolution, we have to consider the state as a whole. The former princely state as it was in 1947 before partition. So I just say that because I think, we mustn't be lazy with our research, and we mustn't be lazy with our rhetoric either, because it doesn't actually help the inhabitants of the state, because it doesn't lead us towards what that resolution might be. The other point that I want to make is that when the government of India in particular talks about it being now a bilateral issue, like it's still a piece of territory to be traded between one country or the other, this is not true anymore. It may have been at the initial stages in 1947, whether the state went to India, whether it went to Pakistan, but the level of rhetoric is now so high, and we cannot but forget the recent incident in Pulwama, where 44 Indian soldiers were killed. It affects all our lives. You've got two nuclear states. It's not even the regions. So I've said this at the end of one of my books, that you cannot say that this is a bilateral issue when the whole region is at stake and the peace of the world is threatened. So I just want us to think that this is a very serious issue. It's as old as Pakistan, because we have to acknowledge that the dispute began in 1947. It's been fluctuating. There have been cycles of violence. There have been cycles of relative peace. There have been some flashes of hope where we've seen that there might be a possible resolution. But the longer you wait, the more dangerous it becomes. And I think this is what we've just seen this recently. It is imperative that there is a resolution of the entire issue. So with that little minor introduction, I'm going to turn first of all to Aysha and ask you, Aysha, you've written so much about the importance of history and historiography and understanding. Kashmir scars, where are we now? Where are we going to go with the Kashmir issue?
I mean, we only have seen, I wrote Kashmir scars in 1990. And so that's 30 years. And all we've seen is more blood flowing, both in the valley and in what we call, quote-unquote, Azad Kashmir. The blood continues to flow, people continue to suffer, militarization continues, the national narratives are framed in securitization imperatives, leaving very little room for a consideration of something that I think should be the number one concern for all decent human beings, and that's humanity. Humanism, our basic humanity, which is daily violated in the valley and also in what is now Azad Kashmir. I mean, because of the militarized nature of the dispute. So what we have here are two states, neither of which we have much control, the powers that be. We are just sort of panelists talking about an area that we care about. But what we do have are people who are very, very damaged. I think that psychologically, the statistics coming out of Kashmir show the psychological damage to Kashmiri people. And I just feel that as Pakistanis and even as citizens of the world, for political reasons, we take our gaze off Kashmir or pretend that everything's fine. And India and Pakistan really have treated this dispute as a real estate dispute. And we simply and must foreground the people. They come first. We must solve this problem. If we don't, we do, as Victoria has eloquently said, face the prospect of a nuclear war.
Well, I think
that's an exaggeration.
It's the worst case scenario.
But you can it can accidentally start off.
I think accidentally, but also I think, you know, for everybody living in the region, poverty eradication, health and education, the great military build-up, all of these things are because of this issue that is battered about between Islamabad and Delhi like a sort of shuttlecock. Meanwhile, people are suffering, and I think it's very difficult to get statistics, but by conventional terms, using Indian sources, at least 70,000 people have been killed since the insurgency began in 1990. You know, it's an extraordinary number of people, and again, we get immune to the number of people. We also get immune to the trauma, and in a previous session I was sitting in, we were talking about the war in Syria and the psychological stress, the trauma of people living as they have been for 30 years now, with militarization. And again, however many military soldiers are there is almost irrelevant. There are an enormous number of soldiers in the Valley of Kashmir. And I think this is something that it's intolerable for the people living there. Now with this latest incident, their lives are put on hold. Our lives aren't necessarily put on hold. We're one step removed. You've got India with its rhetoric against Pakistan, but it's still not as it is for those people living in the valley. And your focus has been, of course, on the region of Azad, Jammu and Kashmir. Again, there is still, you know, a situation there which we're not entirely truthful about, because it's a little bit like in the Valley of Kashmir, there's a particular rhetoric, a particular narrative which comes out. And so perhaps you might like to just, you know, give us the focus of your book and your research.
Sure. I'm going to go back to what you started off with, you know, the monolithic kind of identity we tend to impose as hegemonic nations onto Jammu and Kashmir. You know, when we imagine the Kashmir conflict in Pakistan, but I think as a world as well, we tend to see it confined to the other side of the LOC, to the valley. And that's rightly so because of the sheer degree of violence over there. But Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh and Gilgit-Baltistan and what is called Azad Jammu and Kashmir over here are also linked very much geographically, territorially, strategically, politically, economically to the conflict. So is it possible that the other regions do not face the repercussions? Right? That's the first question. The second question then is, what does it even mean to be Kashmiri? Because traditionally, Kashmiri identity has been linked with the language. And so, you know, the common rhetoric you will often hear is that AJK is not even Kashmir because the people over there speak Pahari or Potahari. But when you look at the Kashmir conflict as a political conflict, you very quickly realize that Kashmiri identity is also political identity. So regardless of the language that you speak or regardless of the region that you're in, you are linked to the conflict. Now when we foreground, you know, with that understanding, and when you go into AJK, you realize that it is very much part of the conflict and it very much suffers the conflict. It is not
both intellectually, ideologically, and physically due to shelling.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I want to just maybe focus on two main areas of the violence and the suffering that I saw. Firstly, I think it's really important to remember that there are many thousands of refugees from across the LOC, from the valley, who have, you know, who came in to AJK and have been living over here. So you actually have people who've gone through the brutality and the torture. They came over and, you know, it's going to be close to 30 years, you know, and they're still divided from their families. And they live in refugee camps without proper sanitation, without proper sewage lines, without proper heating, without any facilities. So the Kashmir conflict is living, it's alive over here. But then you also have people living on the line of control. And more so you have women. So there's also gender dimension to conflict because men have often moved to the cities for work. So it's the women and the children left behind to take care of livelihood, livestock, land, and so forth. And so I've spoken to people, women and children who have literally lived for a decade in bunkers, in and out of bunkers. I've spoken to women who've had to cut their own, flesh to feed their children blood so they don't get dehydrated. There are harrowing stories on this side of the line of control, and when we read the news, we come across these statistics, so many people die, ceasefire violations on this part or that part of Kashmir. But what does that really mean for the people living over there? What does that mean for a generation that could not go to school? What does that mean, when you lose your livestock and your entire source of livelihood? So the conflict has so many shades, and it manifests in the violence, but it also manifests in terms of political and economic concerns and questions about the future. Because if these regions are linked to the Kashmir conflict, right, then that means that Gilgit or AJK, regardless of their political affiliation or association, cannot be provinces. If they cannot be provinces, then they cannot benefit from development as the other provinces do. So what does the future hold, whether or not they affiliate or associate with the Kashmir conflict? It has repercussions for them.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think we need, this is where this composite picture has to be held up. Because without looking at the composite picture, you're not going to get resolution. And you point to the situation with Gilgit-Baltistan. I remember when I was there doing some interviews in 1990s, and I met a gentleman who said he was 57, and he said, I was 7 when I wanted to become part of Pakistan. I'm 57 now, and I'm still wanting to become. Of course, now Gilgit-Baltistan is called Gilgit-Baltistan, and it's no longer the northern areas. But I think this is something also in terms of history, and we're a little bit lazy, and we journalists can be lazy too. I was reading an article in The Guardian following this recent attack in Pulwama, and the report said they were talking about Jammu as the region next door to Kashmir, as though Kashmir was the region where the problem was, and Jammu was not part of the state. So again, I mean, it goes back to your point, which we heard so eloquently in the previous session, Aysha. There's no free lunch. There's no free.
No, well, you've got to do work if you're reporting.
To understand the issue.
But that's why I think I really would like to say a word or two about Anam's book, which I read very, very diligently when she asked me to write a blurb. I mean, I think I really highly recommend it to all of you. We typically think of the Kashmir conflict as confined to Srinagar or the valley. And I must say that I do have some disagreements with her because I do go to the valley and I do think there's some differences. And I don't mean to say this very lightly, but I do think that, in the valley you are stopped and searched at any instant because of suspicion of your religion. Interestingly enough, that's not the reason why people are being oppressed in Azad Kashmir for this conflict. And I think beyond that, there is no difference. So, I mean, I think that in terms of the oppression that the people of the valley feel, it's just something that you have to understand, you have to go and see it. And I think that what has happened to Pakistan, at least in the last few years, when an escalation of violence in this country led Pakistanis, I think, to be more inward looking, move their gaze away from Kashmir. I remember the days when every newscast would begin with Maqbooza Kashmir. I think over the years, the terror bombings in this country have taken over, and many other issues have taken over. And so my last visit to Kashmir, one of my last visits to Kashmir, the Kashmiris complained that Pakistanis hame bhul gaye hain. So I said, no, they have forgotten us. And I said, that's not true. They just have a lot of problems of their own. But one thing that has happened, which I'd like to convey to you all, is that there are gross human rights violations that are beginning to irritate and annoy a lot of my Indian friends as well, and their compatriots, but Pakistanis who are angry because for 70 years they've been fed the Kashmir discourse, and they feel, rightly or wrongly, that this has been partly responsible for the denial of democratic rights because of the way the country evolved. They have adopted the attitude of complete apathy to what is happening today in the valley. And I am absolutely flabbergasted.
Yes, that's sort of the reverse side of the concern.
It's a reaction to a national narrative that has gone nowhere with the main symbol.
You see, I think
would you agree Anam? Or this narrative that people have become apathetic even to what's happening in the valley, far less in Azad Kashmir, which they don't even know about.
Well, when I started researching for the book, that was in 2014, and really Kashmir was not on the map and in terms of what kind of coverage it was getting, and people were not thinking about it. I do think 2016 has changed things. After Farhan Wani's killing, and then the Uri attack, and then the surgical strikes, whether or not they happened, the whole discourse.
The use of pellet guns, I think, is waking people up as well.
So all of that, 2016 has been a game changer. So now you see a little bit more interest and what's happening right now in India with Kashmiris, what happened with Pulwama. I mean, all of that is, again, it's become politically relevant. Kashmir is now again politically relevant, but I think the apathy towards the Kashmiris is absolutely.
But the other problem, I mean, in terms of when you ask me the question, where are we at? That's the Pakistani Act. But the Indian Act is very interesting too, because in India, as the Congress party has withered and given room over the decades recent decades to the BJP, we're in a scenario where no Indian political party, mainstream political party, has the strength to take a major foreign policy decision, far less on a subject like Kashmir. So Kashmir is now intrinsically interconnected with Indian politics, and the fact that you have these pundits, the several myriad strands of pundits who have left Kashmir after Jagmohan allowed them to or asked them to, we don't know, but they did leave. And so their presence out of Kashmir has become the primary obstacle to any kind of resolution. And what I think where we are at today, in 1990 I wrote a solution naively, thinking that we needed solutions. Since then, there have been 50 solutions to Kashmir, and I assure you that the problem in Kashmir today is not the lack of our coming up with solutions, but the lack of political will, which leads me to the next question of where we are at, and that is what I call the political economy of conflict. The political economy of war serves the interests far better than any political economy of peace that you and I can talk about, and that's our tragedy.
It was ever thus. The war dividend pays greater dividends than the peace dividend.
To those who have positions of power, I'll give you an anecdote in the valley. After the driver who first sort of was driving me around was very suspicious, and the first thing he asked me whether I wanted to go to the temple, and I said no. And so after a day or so he relaxed, and then he started, and he says the real problem here are not the militants who are somewhere in the mountains. The real problem are the security forces. It's them. They are oppressing us. They are the main security threat here. So you do have a real issue of a over-occupied Kashmir. And we need to do something about that. But we've lost this narrative. And I don't know, Victoria, I guess I even want to ask you the question of why you think the international community is singularly so apathetic to this.
Yes, I mean, it's another question, and I am being the international person. I mean, perhaps I should also answer that. I mean, in my research, as I say, and I have been decades on this subject, and it's cyclical. I think the interest, it rises, it falls, and unfortunately, again, what we were talking about in another session, the sort of the reporting on the war in Syria, and it was Vanue who was saying, the media is always very interested in the bang bang, but they're less interested in the sort of subsequent solution part. And I, as a journalist going into the Valley of Kashmir, have found it difficult. I'll ring up the editors of foreign news, the newspapers I've worked for, and I'll say, I'm going into Kashmir, I'd like to do a feature. Oh, no, we're covering Iraq today. No, we're covering Syria. There is this fatigue, and it's something that does happen with these issues, that they go on. There's no sort of resolution in sight, and there is a certain fatigue. And I think this is certainly what we saw with the Kashmir issue. Farhan Wani's killing and then the use of pellet guns has suddenly brought it up again. But unfortunately, we have to have an episode like the Pulwama incident. Suddenly it will be on the headlines for a day, 2 days, 3 days, and then it will resolve out again. But what I do think is very significant, in answer to your question, is that India has managed to play a very clever role to portray it as a bilateral issue. And as you know, with the United Nations, notwithstanding there are these resolutions, the Article 2 is no interference in other countries' foreign affairs. And then you get the economic aspect, which is...
And 9/11 effect.
And of course, 9/11, where you get suddenly the division, there's no more freedom fighting, you're either you're terrorists or you're law-abiding citizens.
But would you say that Pakistan has made mistakes in the way it's handled the case? I mean, because you've given us India's position, and you say they've been very good, but has Pakistan been reasonably adept, or have they been
I'm afraid I think Pakistan hasn't been as adept as it can have been, and this goes to the dichotomy of the issue, and, might I say, the rise of the Azadi freedom movement. And Pakistan hasn't really been able to deal with this movement because, and I remember this when I was working on, I think it was my first book, we used to call it the third option, and Pakistan's position was very much there is no third option. The last thing Pakistan was going to do, and again we have to remember we're talking about this large state, is work towards supporting the independence of a state, which would mean losing Gilgit-Baltistan and
One more question, which I can't help it. I have so many questions as well. But the other question is that, I'm not even talking of solutions right now. I think there's an immediate urgency, which is the demilitarization issue.
Immediate.
And how do we bring that about? What can we do? Because there's just too many armed people present in the valley. Well, and in Azad Kashmir on the line of control.
I don't think we can talk about any of this without talking about the bilateral issue, because whether it is or not a bilateral issue, it is treated as one. So as long as the conversations are between India and Pakistan and between the armies, right?
Yes.
And the Kashmiris are not in the discourse. Where are the Kashmiris? With this side or that side? Right?
Well, I mean, this is one of the reasons when I wrote my first book, I wanted to go and find, because I was getting the Pakistan side, the Indian side, and it was to go and find the voice of the Kashmiris. And then, of course, what you do find is that the Kashmiris themselves have different views and different aspirations, depending which region you're talking about. And so that's why it's confusing. But Aysha, I think your point, and this is almost, I want to reverse the question, because the human rights abuses are the only thing that will attract the international
So would
attention.
you say that Pakistan has made the error there? Why didn't they foreground human rights abuses from the outset?
No, I think if you read, they do this. That's one of the issues they will talk about quite regularly. But unfortunately, it doesn't make any difference because, again, this latest attack, it hasn't done.
So it's about the spatialization of identity where people are specific. So it's territory, territorialization. This is where the people don't matter.
Well, this is the very unfortunate thing when you've got a state that, you see, India has got the region it wants. It won't relinquish its claim on the whole state. But on the other hand, it doesn't actually now. If one's honest and you go and talk to any privately off-the-record Indian official, they'll say, no, they don't expect ever that Gilgit-Baltistan will become within India. And,
Yes, and I think that's the other point I'd like to bring to this panel is that what's happening, and a lot of stuff that Pakistanis don't realize in terms of the valley and Kashmir, is that India is doing major infrastructural projects. And so Kashmir is an intrinsic part through those infrastructural projects, which we don't even realize. Yeah. And I think that is what is of great significance and attention.
Well, water, please, we must mention water.
But infrastructural, yes. The tunnels and things and roads that they're building.
I think, again, one has to realize that, the whole question, the Indus Waters Treaty, 1960, at least it's held, but we don't know what's going on up above. But the fact that India is what we call upper riparian state, Pakistan is the lower riparian state, there is no way that India would relinquish the water. And a lot of people have said, well, actually, forget the people. The whole issue about Jammu and Kashmir is retaining control of this strategically very important region, not for the minerals, but for the water. And as we run out of water, it's highly important. Anam.
Can I just also, maybe it's a question, how does CPEC affect everything? Because,
but there's no transparency there.
Exactly. So, if it, and we've been talking about this, it's been in the news, India's raised an issue, it's passing through disputed territory. Does that mean that Pakistan has more stake in bringing stability over there? Does that change things? What are we going to see?
It's a good question. I don't think I have the answer to that.
It brings in China, and a lot of people often say, China should be brought in regards to resolution because China is a stakeholder because of CPEC, but also because in the late 1950s they constructed the road, the 100-mile road through Aksai Chin, which they've taken over. effectively there are no people. They've done this for a purely logistical issue to connect Tibet with Jiangxing province. But they are clearly interested, and if you look at how China has observed the Kashmir issue, they're not prepared to put their necks out, but they are now a stakeholder because they certainly, I mean, the last thing they would want to see is any instability which would upset the CPEC. And for Pakistan's interest, it also doesn't help. But I think, you know, the key thing, which is your point, Aysha, is what can actually reduce the tensions, and now is not a good time to talk about this because of what's going on following Pulwama, but in order to have the troops reduced, therefore you have the human rights abuses.
What I don't understand, I understand that there's a bilateral sort of problem with Pakistan for the Indians. I would then go and man the borders. Why are the troops in the valley, in the cities? I mean, there's a difference between preventing intrusions from Pakistan and oppressing the people of Kashmir. And I want to ask you that there was a fourth panelist. What happened to him? He was a Kashmiri.
Well, that is, I was actually going to mention Mirza Waheed, who was our fourth panelist. I don't have to tell you what is now going on. And again, in my terms of studying the Kashmir issue, this is unprecedented that Kashmiris living in India, many of whom have their embroideries, their shawls and everything woven in Kashmir, and obviously because they can't sell across the LOC, they're selling them in India, and they have been targeted, and this is absolutely unprecedented. And so obviously one doesn't necessarily want to put one's head above the parapet. And it is absolutely appalling that we are really discussing an issue in a vacuum without a representative from Kashmir. But I think the position he's taken is perfectly
I mean, hundreds of Kashmiri students have had to return to the valley, because of threats. I mean, the crowds have attacked Kashmiris across India. So it is indeed unprecedented.
It's unprecedented. I've not seen it.
It invokes memories of the China war when Chinese were put into concentration camps in India. But I don't think that I've seen anything like this.
It also invokes memories of actually the assassination of Indira Gandhi, when over 3,000 Sikhs were killed in Delhi.
But I also think it raises questions about India, and I think some thoughtful Indians are already recognizing the dangers of letting these attacks get too far, because they're also trying to, at least if they can, try and reverse the deep-seated alienation of Kashmiris that most Indians now acknowledge exists.
Yes, well, I think this is something which has happened in the last 5 years, the alienation of a whole new generation of Kashmiris. And again,
it's the youth, it's the Kashmiri youth.
Yeah, but when you're looking at all the coverage in Pulwama right now, everything is focused on, well, did Pakistan sponsor it or not? I mean, few people in India are asking, well, why are so many young boys turning towards militancy? And that, both those questions need to go hand in hand. There needs to be an introspection of the Indian policy in Kashmir. It's obviously not working. Why are you seeing so many Burhan Wanis all of a sudden? Why are people who left arms picking up arms again? In my book I interviewed former militants, people who had given up their education in '89, given up their future and picked up arms and fought that war, and many of them actually relinquished the arms in hopes of dialogue. Let's give this a chance. And what they say now is, we tried. India didn't demilitarize. The solution, there was no solution. There's no political will. So then what choice do we have?
Yes. I mean, this is a generational thing, and it's a cyclical thing, because it started in 1987. We tried the ballot box. That didn't work. Therefore, we felt we must take the gun, get the issue out of cold storage, but then the gun isn't the solution, and you've got a whole new generation of disillusionment. And I think one of the greatest tragedies is that in the late 1990s, the Indian policy technically was to win hearts and minds. And that's been repeated. Yeah. And they've done the total reverse.
Yeah, I mean, we had 2003 ceasefire, right? And it brought respite to so many people's lives. So what you see now is it's exactly the 90s again. You have young boys turning towards militancy. You have allegations, on both sides of the border. You have all that fighting. You have talk of war. And the Azad Kashmiris have been told, just this week, fix your bunkers, build more. There's going to be a blackout. You have to be prepared. So children, in families who had finally come out of those bunkers, going back, starting their education again, building their livelihood, and of course we can't forget the 2005 earthquake, which had already, set them back so significantly. And then they start to rebuild again, and then you have this. So what is, we're talking about how Kashmiris want different things and how they experience the conflict maybe differently depending on where they are. But one thing that's common is that it's vulnerable. It's vulnerability and volatility in everybody's lives, and it's the uncertainty, and it is about when will India and Pakistan, be at loggerheads again, and how's that going to impact us? Because we have no agency over what these states do, but what they do impacts us every single day.
Well, I think the populations of India and Pakistan are held hostage to the issue. And if there's any ray of hope, you mentioned the Indians who have been helping and encouraging the Kashmiris, it's going to be civil society, because I don't think that either country can wait for the governments to do something, because they don't have the mandate, they don't have the will, there's lack of political will. As you say, plenty of solutions are out there, but there's no political will. So ultimately it has to be this movement of civil society which will say enough is enough, because we all are suffering. We are suffering again, as I mentioned, not enough resources for health, education, poverty eradication, all the things that both countries have to deal with.
I can only say that I hang my head in shame when I think of Kashmir and what is happening and has been happening in Kashmir. And I think as South Asians and as human beings, I think that we really ought to try and push towards some degree of sanity, if possible, if at all.
Yes, well, it's the rhetoric. Anam.
Well, I'm just maybe going to divert a little bit and share a story of remarkable resilience that I found at the line of control. So people actually taking, just saying enough is enough. And these are the women of Neelam Valley in particular. I don't know if anyone over here has been there. So these are women, as I was saying earlier, they lost everything. The stories of women having to pick up chopped up body parts of their children to bury. Eventually, they basically organized themselves in this community mobilization of sorts, and they started to hold these peace protests and rallies and holding these white flags. And it might sound very romantic and simplistic, but they would just go and they would march and they would say that, we are going to sit on these streets till you try to do something to bring peace. And Neelam Valley, since 2003, has been relatively one of the most calmest and safer areas. So, and other places continue to see ceasefire violations, and Neelam Valley did not in the same way. Things are changing now, post-2016, but you have these remarkable stories, again, and maybe they need to be told more. They need to, we need to be highlighting both as an international community, but also, I don't know if the local media would, but the international community definitely.
Well, as with all war and conflict, it's the women who are the greatest sufferers. And I think, again, going back to the valley, it's the women who've lost their husbands, it's the women who are half widows, it's the orphans. And again, it really, in the 21st century, it shouldn't be tolerated.
One of the most, you talk about women, and one of the most moving films I've ever seen on Kashmir, made by Ifat Fatima, Lines of Blood. She spent time as a filmmaker, not just short time, but extended periods of time with Kashmiri women, and they talk about the violence and how it has destroyed their lives. I really highly recommend it to you. It's Ifat Fatima, Lines of Blood. It's a film purely from a women's point of view. Kashmiri, what the women of Kashmir are suffering.
There's also a play actually written by an Indian journalist called the Davide. I don't know if any of you have read that, but I saw it put on in a theatre in London, and then they had a panel which I chaired afterwards. And it looks at the issue from all perspectives, and it's actually brilliant because he's captured that trauma, and that's what we have to think about. I'm going to be very generous with question time because we have a lovely, huge audience here, and I feel you all have some perspective on the Kashmir issue. And I see loads of hands waving about. So we're going to have question time now and carry on until 7 o'clock. So if we could just have the lights up and have the mics going. So I can't see, apart from a few waving hands.
There's one right there.
Yes, hello.
Yes, right.
Yeah, this is a question for Dr. Jalal and Victoria Schofield. Why doesn't the Indian state treat Kashmiri Muslims the way that Bihari Muslims or Keralite Muslims are treated? Why this huge difference?
because Kashmir is the only part of Kashmir, or India, that is disputed by Pakistan. In other words, Pakistan has no claim to Kerala. Pakistan has no claim to Bihari Muslims. If anything, they're stranded in Bengal and Bangladesh, and we won't bring them, some of them. So I think that the reason why Kashmir is a exceptional case in India's, from India's point of view, is of Pakistan's claims to it.
Yes, and I think to carry on with the answer with that, it does stem from 1947, and I think it was Tavleen Singh who wrote in her book Tragedy of Errors, Kashmir will always be special, Kashmir will always be suspect, and it is the tragedy of this unresolved issue at the time, that where should the state, again, going back to the full state, the state of Jammu and Kashmir, whether it should belong to Pakistan, whether it should belong to India. And that is the dilemma which you have now.
Hi, I have a question for...
Sorry, who's got the mic?
Sorry, hi. I have a question for Ms. Aysha Jalal. So, the different versions of how Mr. Vajpayee and Musharraf were close to coming up to...
Sorry, I missed you. I can't hear you.
Yes,
sorry, can you hear me now?
I think you should need to speak into the mic.
Okay, I'll speak into the mic now. Okay, so the different versions of how Mr. Vajpayee and Musharraf were close to finding a solution to the Kashmir issue during the Agra summit. So my question is for Ms. Aysha Jalal, that what's her interpretation of that?
I've heard a great deal about how if we hadn't lost Musharraf, i.e. if he hadn't been brought down by the political forces, that Kashmir would have been solved. I'm a great skeptic when it comes to such claims, because if that had indeed been the case, surely we would have had some signs of what's coming. And my further investigation, and of course I've investigated that claim, suggests that if there was an idea, it was simply soft borders. And I would refer you to Manmohan's famous statement that we can't change borders, but we can make them irrelevant. So they were thinking along those lines, and then came the earthquake. And then, of course, eventually, the sheer apathy of Manmohan's second term, where there was the scams, which completely sort of, killed the government, and then the loss of and so that has changed matters quite considerably. So I'm actually of the view that at most, if there was a quote-unquote great brainwave that Musharraf had, it was nothing more than soft borders.
Yes, I didn't present you. Yes.
My question.
Wait a minute. Yes, where are you? Oh, good.
Hello.
Yes, hello. Okay.
Hello, my question to Aysha is that don't you think that Kashmir question is the continuation of the communal division of India, and it serves into the analogy of two-nation theory and Nazariya Pakistan, and on the other hand, Hindutva communalism. That's not the political economy of conflict. And both the states are not ready to think beyond the prism of India-Pakistan conflict. And they use Kashmir issue to serve their purpose of militarization and undemocratization. We in Pakistan are very much concerned about the rights and right to self-determination of Kashmiris. But when we talk about the repression of Baloch, we just keep quiet. And our passion for right to self-determination is exhausted or compromised when it comes to Pashtuns or Sindhis or Baloch.
Your question?
There is no question, but I agree with you. Thank you very much. Next question.
Okay, next question. Okay, second hand.
You have done a great agreement.
I'm sorry?
I agree with you. I don't think there is any disagreement. It's a question of interpretation. You want to see the solution through the communal. Yes, that's one point. It does not actually exclude my argument. They're both mutually, they're compatible. But I have no disagreement with you in terms of what serves India and Pakistan's purpose in letting Kashmir burn to death.
Your question? Yes.
My question is to Dr. Jalal.
I can't see anybody. I don't know where
he's here. He's just there.
You can hear my voice. Well, do you think that the lingering of this Kashmir issue makes a case against the concept of the nation states?
Sorry, what's your
Sorry, yes, can we hear that again?
I couldn't hear.
Do you think that the lingering of this Kashmir issue makes a case against the concept of the nation states?
the lingering of the makes...
No, I mean it doesn't, because what is the nation state but a hyphenated nation? So the point is that the Kashmir got squared up with India, the nation state of India, and so it's part of the nation state's efforts to sort of sort itself out. But I think Kashmir, as Victoria has eloquently not only said in the panel, but written brilliantly in her book on Kashmir, which I recommend to all of you as must read, shows that it is connected to decolonization. It is a question of decolonization, and we could, if there was political will, the Kashmir problem is solvable, in my view, relatively easier than the Arab-Israeli problem. But the tragedy is that the two nations of India and Pakistan do not see the interest in solving the problem, which is the same issue. You want to call it communal, I'm calling it the political economy of war or conflict, which serves interests, that's all.
Yes, and I think the moments of potential solution are so, it's a glimpse. You feel you're almost there, but then somehow people tend to pull back. Because it's easier for the status quo. One of the traditional things is the status quo is not working, but everybody is too frightened to have anything other than the status quo. So they say one thing, but actually mean another. And this is certainly what I found with the Kashmiris. You somehow, again, as Aysha says, the political economy of war is more beneficial. And to look into the crystal ball and think, well, actually, we want to have peace, people pull back. And what I will say is that one has to retain one's hope and also retain an awareness of the issue, because there might just be that chink of opportunity. And so if one's asleep or got one's back turned, then again it will be lost. There's a question here, this lady. Yes. Nice to have a lady. Can you stand? Who are you? Stand up. Yeah. Yes, this lady. Oh, we're having him first. Okay. Right, first, and then you.
Thank you. There seems to be a distinct sort of a lack of international, or more specifically Western attention on Kashmir. I don't mean to draw parallels or compare sufferings, but CNN and BBC will spend all day covering violence in Palestine, but that is not the case for Kashmir. Is it merely because India is quickly becoming an ally of the US in containing China? But that's not a good enough explanation, because Israel is also an ally of the US. So why the lack of a relative lack of international attention on Kashmir? If I may use the term, the so-called human rights lobby in the West seems to be a bit silent on Kashmir as compared with other issues.
Well, I think if you talk to the... It's a good question, but if you talk to the Palestinians, they don't feel they've had nearly enough attention either. I think in terms of the international, also I will say this with the international community and civil society, they have done an enormous amount on human rights. And, if you look at Amnesty International reports, you look at the European Parliament, but they get stuck on moving beyond condemning human rights. And India, as we know, has become not less powerful, but more powerful. And I'm afraid to say, again, going back to the political economy, it's not just a war between India and Pakistan, it's political economy in general. You look at the way the United States goes, you look at the way the United Kingdom goes to India, they're looking for trade deals. Do they mention the word Kashmir? No, they don't. The last time a British official mentioned Kashmir was in 1997, when the Foreign Secretary Robin Cook was here for the 50th anniversary celebrations, and he made a very sort of mild comment in Islamabad, and got them, the Queen then, who was on the trip, obviously got the most frosty reception from India. And it was at the time when Ike Gujral said that Britain had no right to talk about Kashmir. It was a third-rate power on a par with Ireland. So, as I say, if the country doesn't want facilitation, mediation, it's very difficult. I've had people say, well, Britain ought to go to war with India, but it's not as simple as that.
Add one more thing for your purposes, which I think will just, I'd like to give you a little history of the Kashmir conflict in the international community. The international community expended a huge amount of energy from between 47 in the early 50s to try and sort out Kashmir. Victoria's hit it on the head by saying that you can't, the UN cannot mediate if one party is not willing to accept mediation. India did not want to, I mean, the whole thing fell apart in terms of UN efforts to mediate between India and Pakistan on Kashmir on the issue of whether or not there would be a plebiscite organization and whether India would be allowed to keep its control whilst the plebiscite was taking place, or whether the plebiscite would be held under the UN. They could not agree. India kept saying Pakistan has to withdraw. Pakistan kept saying plebiscite has to be held under the UN. So nothing happened. So, and then the world lost interest by 54 because what was going on at the same time was India's efforts to just make Kashmir come, you know, I mean, they started off with a special status and throughout from 47 to the early 50s, they put a stranglehold, they diluted Kashmir's special status. So when the world saw that, they saw no purpose in mediating. So you've got to understand the context of this. It's not that the international community has always ignored it. It's just that now it looks like that they are not interested. And I think that's the big question. Is it because of India's success? Is it because people don't want to talk about movements, or is it simply because of Pakistan's behavior and people not wanting to, countries not wanting to support Pakistan? And I do think that the narrative of the Muslim terrorist and terrorism, I've heard on many occasions that Kashmir is the future bedrock of Muslim terrorism. I've obviously argued that it's more likely to be one if you don't solve the problem. But that issue continues.
Yes. No, and I think, I agree with Aysha. I think it is not some great conspiracy theory, but you come up against a brick wall. And, you know, if you're looking at it as a sort of an academic study, you would say, well, it would be much better to have a mediator, much better to have a facilitator, because then you can blame the facilitator for any compromise you may or may not have had to make, especially with a domestic community that would say sell out and, you know, lost our principles. So one would say that it would be more sensible, but I go back to the original point, which is that India is actually occupying the region that it wants to retain, and there the matter has stuck. And we have this young lady here.
So yes. I wanted to ask, do you think that Kashmiris have some power, the indigenous agency to form a resistance?
Sorry, do they have, the Kashmiris have some power?
The indigenous agency to form a resistance of their own.
The Kashmiris have been resisting. They are resisting right now. I mean, they have agency. It's a very difficult scenario, but they've been resisting. But what's interesting is that unlike the 90s, when certain political groupings were calling the shots, now it's the youth. So, I mean, beginning in 2008, it was the youth who took over. And I mean, they really have sort of been, I mean, the leaders are following the young people. I think that is a very interesting change. We don't know where it will go. But I'm not sure, I think the resistance is not going to end. If anything, there are signs of enhanced desire to resist amongst the youth of Kashmir. So I think in Pakistan, I think there has to be some acknowledgement that this problem is not going to go anywhere. And as Victoria has already said, at every time this escalates, you are going to be in the midst of it. So how are you going to react?
And it's worse. I mean, I think just in terms of a little bit of history, the 1990s, when, as Anam said, this idea of taking up the gun started, all the political parties had a militant wing. And it very much stemmed, and we have to put it in the regional context, from the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen, which entered the vocabulary. I remember I was working at BBC at the time, and we had a big issue as should it be in italics, should it be in inverted commas, what is this word that's entered our vocabulary? Mujahideen, freedom fighters. And that existed and very much inspired these Kashmiris who call themselves freedom fighters. But of course, then you had 9/11, and the boundary between freedom fighting and notwithstanding, people were reminding everyone that George Washington took up arms against the British and he was a freedom fighter. Yes, I'm sure you've heard of that one. It somehow the line was, there was no difference. A terrorist was a freedom fighter, and it became very difficult. And they also felt they weren't getting anywhere. There were losses, and that's when you got back into the political cycle. But now, as Aysha says, there's a whole new generation, and they're taking up the gun. It's less formulated than it was because you don't quite have these political parties with their militant wings.
I'll just say one thing in addition to the resistance issue, which you very well put. I think that it's not just resistance with the gun. My own students who've come to Tufts, studied, Kashmiri students, and gone back, they're not taking up the gun. They're certainly taking up the pen, and some are taking to rap. So I think that what's most fascinating about Kashmir is the youth and the way in which they are resisting. And that actually, in my humble opinion, is what's unnerving the Indian security forces more than anything else, which is why they have been resorting to disproportionate violence against the Kashmiris. These pelters, stone pelters, they're just throwing stones, are being you just see their faces pockmarked with the pellets that they are sort of firing out. So it's a disproportionate use because they're rattled by the sheer ferocity of the resistance of the Kashmiris.
Yeah, I'm just going to add to that. I mean, absolutely. It's the people who pick up guns that get the most, they're highlighted. But like I was talking with the women, the protest, that's a form of resistance. Picking up the form is a part of resistance. Music, all of these things. So there are different forms of resistance, one of which is to go back to picking up the arms, which is, of course, very, very frightening, for both nations, but for Kashmiris more than anything else. It's Kashmiris' lives on the line.
And I think actually one of the tragedies that I've seen is that the picking up of the gun and the youth, they know they're not going to be able to take on the Indian army, but it's been this just cause. We have a just cause. The international community will see our just cause, see that we're being killed and interfere. And this was a narrative that played very much in the 1990s.
This is somebody who had picked up arms. That's what he said. He said, I never really wanted to and I never really agreed with it, so I left it very quickly. But I will say that, picking up arms put Kashmir on the map. No one really cared about Kashmir before.
I'd like to add to that. Yasin Malik is someone I think all of you know about. And when Yasin came to Tufts to speak at the Fletcher School after 9/11, I asked him, you've given up the gun. Are you advocating giving up the gun to the Kashmiris? And he said, no. Never give up the gun. Because if we give up the gun, India won't take us seriously. Look what they've done to the Mizos. You can't give up the gun. I've given up the gun. I've become a Gandhian, but because they tortured him, and he's made his own decisions. But the fact is that he doesn't advocate giving up the gun. That's the interesting point.
Yeah, it's very impressive. This gentleman here. Oh, 5 minutes left. Right, we've got you, and then we've got you. Where's the mic? Oh, we're here. Okay, so what have you? We've got these 3 questions. Yes. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So my question is more towards Anam right now. It's about, you've talked about all these harrowing stories of the women who were living there. Don't you think that these stories have a bigger impact on everyone's perception of the situation over here? Then why is it that Pakistan does not take up these stories? Why does it not use these maybe as propaganda or whatever you may choose to call it to actually further their issue in this, their stance on this? Why is there such a silence on Kashmir from the media in itself here?
I don't think there's a silence. I think you get a lot of statistics coming in. What I think happens with ceasefire violations is both sides only report on the violations on their side. So you will never hear of anybody being killed in Pakistani firing, on the Indian side. And similarly in India, they also have a reporting on ceasefire violations, but it's only about how many people died from Pakistani firing. So it's selective. And it does help beef up narratives on both sides. But I think this is not a Kashmir problem. This is a war reporting problem where we get stuck with statistics rather than, looking at, the people that Dr. Jalal was talking about. They need to be at the fore. They're often not. And I think this applies to most wars and conflicts, especially protracted ones that have gone on for so long.
Well, yes, but you haven't got the mic yet. So we've got the mic here. We've got to have the mic first. Yes, this lady here.
Yeah, hi. Is the mic working?
I can say to you about hopelessness and the hope that there is. But that also requires political will. So my political will issue was my point that I am not hopeless about Kashmir when I look at the actual realities of the conflict. I just said to you that it's an easier conflict to solve than Arab-Israel. largely because I've studied the issue, and I think it's India and Pakistan's real estate dispute over Kashmir. So one way to change that is to basically to make India and Pakistan understand that they are utilizing a concept of space. You know, the ideas of space historically have changed through history. And the idea of space that India and Pakistan have stuck on is an idea that the colonial state conceived of for its own purposes. And so that was the idea of monolithic absolute sovereignty. Sovereignty is a human construct. The very nations who talk about absolute non-negotiable sovereignty, the way India talks or Pakistan talks, have moved on, with all their problems in Europe, towards a supra-sovereign entity to see how that might solve their problems. In other words, sovereignty and space are human conceptions. So when you are ready to change that conception, and one of the things I did, which is why this is called Kashmir Scars, I wrote a piece in 1990 which tried to come up with a solution where nothing really would change other than conceptions of space by India and Pakistan, and then suitable changes in their constitutions. So the point is that it can be solved. I'm actually not hopeless. The hopelessness for me stems from the sufferings of the people of Kashmir, not because I think that Kashmir cannot be solved.
And as we know, when you have a hopeless situation, they're very resilient.
My question to the panelists is, do you think the change of government in India can be a step towards resolution of Kashmir? Because Pakistan is forthcoming in holding dialogue with India.
Look, there was a Congress government for decades, and there was no solution. And then came along good old Vajpayee, and there was some hope. And then came along Narendra Modi, and there is no hope. So, I am not about to wager. I do not see a breakthrough possible, which is where my hopelessness for their suffering increases, not because I think that this is just a hopeless case.
And unfortunately, the latest Pulwama attack has not helped. Anam, I think you must also ask this word. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Yes. No, I'm really sorry that we're going to ask it later because I'm going to thank Dr. Aysha Jalal and Anam Zakaria very much indeed for coming.
Thank you.